Welcome back to the Promised Seed, Abraham and his progeny. Today, we're cooking up something special as we dive into Martin Luther's insights on some pretty hefty theological issues from the early church. So grab your aprons and get ready.
As you've already heard, there were a number of controversies and heresies in the early church. And one of the more notable of those controversies was one propagated by Nestorius and ultimately addressed in the Council of Chalcedon. Martin Luther wrote a document called On the Councils and the Churches, in which he outlined the history of Nestorian heresy and the second heresy propagated by Eutyches in response to Nestorius. He delved into these heresies and attempted resolutions of Christological controversies, and in so doing gives very helpful insight into his evangelical understanding of the person and nature of Christ. In this episode, we'll walk through Luther's document to unpack some of its key points.
In good rhetorical fashion, Luther begins his essay by outlining the history of the Nestorian controversy, including the politics at play in that time. He also analyzed what Nestorius is alleged to have said regarding the two natures and two persons of Christ. Interestingly, Luther comes to the conclusion that Nestorius did not truly believe there were two Christs, or two persons, as there are no examples of Nestorius actually saying that. Rather, said Luther, that was a claim made by the Pope and his followers to discredit Nestorius.
Which begs the question, what was Nestorius condemned for, and why was it so important that a third council was held against him? According to Luther, Nestorius admitted that Christ was the Son of God and was born of the Virgin Mary according to his humanity, not according to his divinity, as all Christians say. But there he ran into a logical conundrum. Nestorius could not say, logically, that Mary should be called the Mother of God, since Christ did not receive his deity from her as he had his humanity. As Luther put it, Nestorius' whole argument was this: God cannot be born or have his divine nature from a human being, and a human being cannot bear God or give God his divine nature. Why not? As you recall from several of our earlier lectures, by the 5th century, philosophy had taken a firm hold in Christian conversations. So Nestorius was simply applying logic to the birth of Christ.
Not so fast, said Luther. Luther sailed into that purported logic and wrote this: It should therefore be said that Mary is the true natural mother of the child called Jesus Christ, and the true mother and bearer of God. Thus, whatever else can be said of the children's mothers can be said of her. They suckle their children, bathe them, give them food and drink, and Mary suckled God, rocked God, made broth and soup for God. For God and man are one person, one Christ, one Son, one Jesus.
Luther didn't stop there in his analysis of Nestorius and his attempted separation of Jesus' divinity and humanity. Rather, he pointed out the somewhat ironic logical flaw in Nestorius' position. So let's walk through Luther's argument here. Nestorius' error, said Luther, was not that he believed Christ was a mere man or that he really believed Christ was two persons. No, Nestorius' error was that he would not admit to a communicatio idiomatum, a communication of the attributes of divinity and humanity. We'll talk much more about the communicatio idiomatum in later lectures, but for now we can say an idiomata is the property that can be attributed to one's human nature, or both the human nature and the divine nature in the case of Christ. So eating, sleeping, crying are all idiomata, attributes of being human, while being immortal, infinite, not being born, sleeping, and crying are all idiomata or attributes of divinity. The error Nestorius fell into, said Luther, was that he admitted God and man were united in one person, Christ, but he could not admit that the idiomata of the divine and the human could also be united.
Eutyches too committed this error according to Luther, but he did so on the other side of the same coin. In other words, Eutyches responded to Nestorius, and in so doing, he made the claim that the idiomata of divinity cannot be ascribed to the idiomata of humanity, so the opposite claim as Nestorius made. At the root, however, both Nestorius and Eutyches fell into the same error according to Luther. They firmly separated the divinity and humanity of Christ. In other words, by applying logic to Scripture, neither Nestorius nor Eutyches would say the divine and human attributes of Christ communicated, as in the communicatio idiomata.
Again, we'll devote an entire episode to the communicatio idiomatum, but it's important here to recognize Luther's point that Nestorius' error was not ultimately what was attributed to him by the Council of Ephesus. Rather, Nestorius balked at something many Christians balk at, and that is, if the idiomata of Christ are united, then God died on the cross. In other words, as Scripture made clear, and as Luther held true to Scripture, then he asserted all the idiomata of Christ's divinity and humanity were so united as to be inseparable. Therefore, when Jesus was crucified and died on the cross, God died.
I suspect that statement, God died, is one that catches our ear and likely causes you some concern. And of course, the reaction is precisely what Nestorius and others experienced as well. Logically, God cannot die. Therefore, logically, we must find a way to separate Christ's divinity from his humanity in order to preserve God from death. The problem with such attempts, of course, is precisely what Luther identified in his essay. When it comes to Scripture, and specifically to attempts to answer questions that Scripture does not reveal, then logic, philosophy, has no place. We cannot apply our own sense of logic and reason to Scripture and expect the result to be anything other than heresy. Because in so doing, we are literally committing the original sin, attempting to know what God alone knows. Certainly, said Luther in his essay, simple reason has a role to play in our daily lives, and it has a role to play even in our confession about Christ driven by Scripture. But when it comes to matters of Scripture, then to quote Luther, the logic of Nestorius and Eutyches is a common plague. Not because Luther is advocating that we check simple human reason at the door in matters of faith, but because Nestorius, Eutyches, and others were using logic, philosophy, to attempt to know what only God can know.
We can summarize Luther's assessment of the utility of councils and even our use of the Church Fathers with the following quote from his essay on the councils and the churches. Quote, "Whoever is thus disposed may read more of the history of the councils. I read myself into a bad humor with it. Such pickering, confusion, and disorder prevailed there that I am really inclined to believe Gregory of Nazianz, the teacher of St. Jerome, who, having lived before this time, and having witnessed better councils and fathers, still wrote, 'To tell the truth, I believe it advisable to flee all the councils of bishops, for I saw nothing good resulting from the councils, not even the abolition of evil, rather sheer ambition and quarreling over precedents, etc.'" End quote.
Luther ended his assessment of Nestorius, Eutyches, and the attempted resolution in the council by returning to Scripture. In other words, he addressed the issue of Christ's divinity and humanity evangelically. And so he cited several New Testament passages in which both the divinity and humanity are ascribed to Jesus in one simple statement, such as John 5:27 and Matthew 22:43. And then Luther went to the Old Testament source of the promised seed, Christ, in Genesis 3:15 and 22:18. In those passages, of course, God promises that his seed, the tzarah, of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, and thus will defeat sin, death, and the devil.
These are clearly divine idiomata. And yet, they are repeatedly identified as belonging to the Son of David, Christ.
Of course, our human reason fails to understand this, and of course, the attempted resolution of such attempts similarly fail, as Luther identified.
And so, it is not to the theologians or councils Luther looked to talk about the divinity and humanity of Christ.
Rather, he ended his essay as follows: "We too, therefore, must have for our faith something more, and something more certain than the councils. That something more and more certain is the Holy Scriptures."